137 drones and 7 missiles, most of them intercepted, but not all of them. There was a strike on a refinery complex that started a fire, which has been put out, but it just shows you how vulnerable the energy infrastructure is.
4 MH-47G Chinook helicopters sat on the deck of the USS Bataan, their long tandem rotors slicing slowly through the humid night air of the Persian Gulf. It was 2:41 a.m. local time. The sea was black and calm. The only lights came from dim red deck lamps reflecting off steel and fuel hoses. No one on the flight deck spoke. Inside the helicopters, 120 operators from 2 elite U.S. Special Operations units sat in silence, helmets down, weapons locked between their knees. Every man knew the plan. They had rehearsed it dozens of times on mock refinery structures built in the desert thousands of miles away. The target sat on the Iranian coast. Bandar Abbas Petrochemical Complex. It was one of the largest oil refining facilities in the country, capable of processing more than 350,000 barrels of crude oil per day. Satellite images showed an industrial city of pipes, towers, and storage tanks stretching across the coastline. But intelligence analysts believed the facility was doing far more than refining oil. Signals intercepts, financial tracking, and human sources inside the refinery workforce suggested the complex had become a key hub in Iran's sanctioned oil network, quietly funneling revenue through offshore intermediaries. That money, according to U.S. intelligence, was being redirected toward missile programs and drone production. For weeks, diplomats tried to stop it. Sanctions tightened. Messages passed through Oman. Warnings were delivered through European intermediaries. Nothing changed. 11 weeks earlier, planning for the raid began. Now, the operation had reached its final stage. At 2:45 a.m., the launch signal came through encrypted radios. The helicopter crews powered up. The rotors accelerated into a deafening roar. Within seconds, the 4 Chinooks lifted off the deck and turned north, flying low across the dark water of the Gulf. 2 AH-64 Apache attack helicopters rose behind them, slipping into escort positions. The formation immediately dropped to under 70 feet above the water. The pilots flew nap of the earth, hugging the surface to stay below Iranian radar coverage. Above them, invisible in the black sky, an RQ-4 Global Hawk surveillance drone circled at 60,000 feet, feeding real-time infrared imagery to command centers aboard the USS Bataan and directly into the helmet displays of the team leaders. Every movement around the refinery had already been mapped. Security patrol routes, camera coverage zones, guard rotations, vehicle schedules. Every detail had been studied for weeks. But war plans rarely survive first contact with reality. At 3:02 a.m., the helicopters crossed into Iranian airspace. Inside the drone's infrared view, the refinery appeared as a glowing maze of heat signatures. Towers vented hot gases into the night sky. Pipelines radiated warmth like veins across the industrial complex. But the perimeter looked quiet. Guards were following their usual patrol paths. No alarms, no unusual radio traffic. For the moment, the element of surprise was holding. The helicopters continued inland, slowing as they approached the shoreline. The insertion point was a narrow industrial strip on the refinery's western edge, a gap between 2 camera towers where analysts had identified a blind spot in the surveillance system. At 3:07 a.m., the first Chinook flared for landing. Its wheels touched Iranian soil seconds later. The rear ramp dropped before the helicopter had even settled. Operators flooded out in disciplined silence. 30 men from each helicopter spread into pre-assigned teams, moving fast across gravel and concrete toward their objectives. 3 teams headed toward the primary distillation towers, the massive steel structures that form the core of the refinery's processing capability. Another team moved toward the central control building, where computer systems regulated pressure, temperature, and flow across the entire facility. A final security element stayed near the landing zone, preparing the route for extraction if things went wrong. The teams advanced quickly between pipelines and machinery. The refinery was loud, the constant hiss of gas pressure, the rumble of pumps, the metallic clank of industrial equipment. Those sounds helped hide their movement, but the first complication came sooner than expected. At 3:10 a.m., the drone operator monitoring the facility noticed something unusual. A security vehicle had deviated from its patrol route. Not by much, just a few hundred meters. But the new path would take it directly toward the team approaching the control building. Inside the lead operator's headset, a calm voice transmitted the warning. The team leader didn't hesitate. 2 operators broke from formation, sprinting forward through the maze of pipes and storage tanks. The guard vehicle rolled slowly toward them, headlights dim. The encounter lasted less than 5 seconds. Suppressed rifle fire cracked twice in the darkness. The vehicle stopped, and the raid continued deeper into the refinery. But time was already running out. Charges on the heart of the refinery. The 2 guards were pulled from the vehicle and dragged behind a large concrete equipment housing. Their radios were removed and switched off. The entire interruption lasted less than 10 seconds. By 3:12 a.m., the team moving toward the control building was already advancing again, weaving through a forest of pipes and steel structures. Across the refinery, the other teams had reached their targets. The primary distillation columns rose more than 50 meters into the air. Massive towers of steel where crude oil was heated and separated into different fuels. Without them, the refinery would be useless. Each demolition team moved with rehearsed precision. Backpacks opened. Charges came out. These were not simple explosives. They were shaped demolition charges, designed to cut through specific structural points inside the facility's most critical systems. Every placement had been calculated weeks earlier. Operators climbed the ladders of the distillation towers and attached explosives at load-bearing support joints, the locations where the towers connected to their base piping and processing lines. If those points failed simultaneously, the entire structures would collapse inward under their own weight. Meanwhile, a second group moved toward the vacuum distillation unit, another crucial component used to process heavy crude oil. Thermite cutters were placed along the feed lines. Another team reached the catalytic cracking unit, the system responsible for turning heavy hydrocarbons into gasoline and diesel. Destroying it would cripple the refinery's output for years. The operators worked quickly. Every charge was timed, every cable routed carefully. At 3:14 a.m., the control building team reached the facility's central operations center. The structure stood 2 stories tall, surrounded by chain fencing and security cameras. The cameras were already looping old footage, a trick quietly inserted into the refinery's network hours earlier by cyber specialists. But one part of the intelligence picture had been wrong. 2 armed guards stood inside the entrance security station. They reacted faster than expected. One of them managed to slam a palm down on a panic alarm switch. A burst signal shot through the refinery's internal communication network before the system was jammed by electronic warfare equipment aboard one of the Apache helicopters circling offshore. The signal lasted less than 3 seconds. No one knew if it had reached anyone outside the facility. The operators didn't wait to find out. The door was breached instantly. Inside, the team cleared the building in under a minute. Rooms were checked, hallways secured. By 3:15 a.m., they reached the central control room. Inside were the servers and monitoring systems that regulated the refinery's entire processing network. Thousands of sensors controlling pressure valves, pump systems, and fuel distribution. Destroying them digitally would take time. And time was the one thing the assault team didn't have. Instead, the operators pulled out thermite charges. When ignited, thermite burns at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel. They placed the devices directly on the server racks and control processors. The thermite ignited. White-hot flames poured across the equipment. In less than 40 seconds, the refinery's control system was reduced to melted metal. Across the complex, demolition teams finished setting their final charges. The explosive packages were linked together with synchronized timers. When they detonated, they would trigger a chain collapse of the refinery's core infrastructure. But the clock was already turning against them. At 3:18 a.m., the drone operator monitoring the surrounding highways saw something that instantly changed the timeline. Vehicle movement, 3 trucks, then 5, then 8. Headlights off, moving fast. They were coming from a Revolutionary Guard garrison located about 4 kilometers north of the refinery. The alarm signal had been received. Inside the refinery, the mission commander heard the update through his headset. The window for a clean withdrawal was disappearing. He made the call immediately. One word transmitted across every radio: collapse. That meant the mission had entered its final phase. All remaining objectives were abandoned. Every team moved toward the extraction point. Operators grabbed their gear and began sprinting through the refinery's maze of pipes and tanks. The Chinook helicopters, waiting offshore after the initial insertion, were already turning back toward the coastline. Above the highway, the Apache escorts moved into attack positions. They hovered low behind a ridgeline, targeting systems locking onto the approaching convoy. Inside the refinery, the demolition timers continued counting down. 5 minutes left. Then 4. And the Iranian response forces were getting closer every second. The response convoy. The refinery teams were already moving when the first vehicles appeared on the highway. Through the infrared feed from the Global Hawk drone, the convoy showed up as bright white shapes racing through the darkness. 8 vehicles, 2 pickup trucks in front, armored transport vehicles behind them. They were moving fast. Inside the assault team's headsets, the drone operator's voice remained calm. Convoy confirmed. 8 vehicles, distance 3 kilometers, closing fast. The operators didn't slow down. They moved between pipes and storage tanks, heading straight for the shoreline extraction point, where the helicopters would return. But the convoy wasn't slowing either. At 3:21 a.m., the first truck reached a straight stretch of highway leading directly toward the refinery's main gate. That was when the Apache helicopters moved. The 2 gunships had already slipped into firing positions along the northern approach road. Their pilots watched the convoy through night vision sensors, the vehicles glowing on their targeting displays. The lead Apache locked its laser guidance system. Inside the cockpit, the weapons officer spoke a single word. Rifle. A Hellfire missile dropped from the wing rail and ignited. It streaked across the dark desert in seconds. The missile struck the lead truck just outside the refinery perimeter. The explosion tore the vehicle apart instantly. Fire rolled across the road. The convoy scattered. Some vehicles tried to reverse. Others swerved into drainage ditches along the highway. But a few kept moving forward. That was enough. The Apaches fired again. Another Hellfire missile slammed into the second vehicle in line, flipping it sideways across the road. The highway was now completely blocked. The remaining trucks tried to turn around, but the narrow road left little space to maneuver. The Apache crews switched weapons. Their 30mm chain guns opened fire. Bright tracer rounds cut across the desert highway, punching through engine blocks and tires. Within less than a minute, the convoy had been stopped cold. None of the vehicles reached the refinery, but inside the facility, the assault teams were still racing against the clock. The demolition charges were counting down. 3 minutes left. The operators reached the shoreline landing zone at 3:24 a.m. The helicopters were still inbound. Over the radio came the sound of rotor blades approaching from the south. But the extraction wasn't going to be clean. As the teams gathered near the gravel shoreline, gunfire suddenly erupted from the northeastern edge of the refinery. A group of security guards had taken cover behind equipment buildings and fuel tanks. They had stayed hidden during the raid. Now they opened fire. Bullets snapped through the darkness. Operators immediately dropped into defensive positions. Suppressing fire answered back. One operator was hit in the shoulder as he moved toward the shoreline. Another round struck the ceramic plate in another soldier's body armor, knocking him sideways but not penetrating. The wounded operator was pulled to his feet and dragged toward the landing zone by 2 teammates. Despite the injury, he continued firing bursts toward the refinery buildings as they moved. Seconds later, the first Chinook helicopter roared over the shoreline. Its landing lights remained off. The aircraft touched down hard on the gravel strip. The rear ramp dropped. Operators began loading immediately. The other helicopters arrived seconds later, landing in a staggered formation along the beach. Gunfire from the refinery continued. Apache gunships moved closer, firing short bursts from their cannons toward the buildings where the guards were hiding. The suppression was enough. By 3:29 a.m., the last assault team climbed onto the final helicopter. The wounded operator was secured inside. The ramp slammed shut. The Chinooks lifted off together, rising into the night sky and turning back toward the Persian Gulf. Below them, the refinery stretched across the coastline. Pipes, towers, storage tanks, all of it still looked intact. But that was about to change. The demolition timers were reaching 0. 32 minutes later. The Chinooks were already 4 kilometers out over the Persian Gulf when the countdown reached its final seconds. Inside the helicopters, the operators sat strapped into their seats, weapons resting across their laps. The roar of the engines filled the cargo bay. No one spoke. They all knew what was about to happen. Below them, the refinery still looked intact from the air. The distillation towers stood tall above the maze of pipes and tanks. Steam vents continued releasing clouds of white vapor into the night sky. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the first charge detonated. At 3:32 a.m., A deep flash erupted at the base of the refinery's primary distillation towers. The explosion was not massive at first, just a sudden burst of orange light. But the effect was immediate. The towers shuddered. Their support joints, weakened by the precisely placed demolition charges, failed at the same moment. The towering steel structures began to collapse inward. The second wave of explosions followed almost instantly. The vacuum distillation unit detonated next. Then, the catalytic cracking system. Inside the refinery's pipelines, thousands of barrels of crude oil and refined fuel products were still moving through the processing network. When the towers collapsed, those pressurized hydrocarbons ignited. What followed was a chain reaction. A massive fireball erupted into the night sky, climbing hundreds of meters above the coastline. Inside the Chinooks, the operators felt the pressure wave ripple through the air even at their distance. A bright orange glow spread across the horizon behind them. More explosions followed. Storage tanks ruptured. Fuel lines burst. Processing units ignited. Within seconds, the refinery had turned into a raging inferno. The flames were visible from ships nearly 30 kilometers away in the Persian Gulf. Back inside the drone's infrared camera feed, the facility disappeared under a massive cloud of heat and smoke. Secondary explosions continued across the complex as burning crude spread through the pipelines. Some blasts sent fragments of steel hundreds of meters into the air. Others collapsed entire sections of the refinery's processing yard. The chain reaction lasted nearly 11 minutes. By the time Iranian emergency crews reached the facility, the central processing zone was already destroyed. Satellite images taken hours later showed a massive blackened area where the refinery's core systems once stood. The 3 primary distillation towers were gone completely. The catalytic cracking unit had collapsed into twisted metal. The central control building was a burned-out shell. The refinery had been reduced to a smoldering industrial ruin. Initial estimates suggested the facility would not produce fuel again for at least 4 years. But the consequences of the raid were only beginning. Within hours, footage of the burning refinery spread across global news networks. Commercial satellite companies released high-resolution imagery of the destruction. Oil markets reacted immediately. When trading opened that morning, Brent crude surged nearly $9 per barrel in early trading. Energy analysts warned that the attack could disrupt regional fuel supply chains and trigger new volatility across global markets. In Tehran, the government issued its first response statement before noon. Officials from the Supreme National Security Council condemned the strike as a direct act of war. They promised retaliation, but they did not specify when or how. Across the Persian Gulf, military activity intensified. The U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain moved to its highest alert level. American bases across Iraq and Syria increased defensive readiness in anticipation of possible missile or drone attacks. 3 U.S. carrier strike groups were already repositioning across the region. The aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, operating in the northern Arabian Sea, was placed on full combat readiness. Fighter squadrons began launching patrol flights over key shipping lanes. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway carrying nearly 20% of the world's oil supply, was raised to its highest maritime security alert. The region had entered a dangerous new phase, and every government in the Middle East knew it. Because once a strike like this happens, the response is never far behind.